Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's lecture on African American arts through the mid 20th century. I want to say a few words about this before we get started today. The first is, while it doesn't really let me off the hook, an acknowledgement that, one kind of fairly brief lecture on African American arts from basically the late 19th century through the middle 20th century is not enough to give you a good picture or go into depth about the context of both black artists in America and black culture in the wider context of American history. It's a little bit better than nothing, but honestly, it would be nice to spend a bit more time on this. But in these types of survey classes, these big subjects that really deserve a lot more attention sometimes get less attention. And this class is primarily, as most surveys are, about looking at the key players, kind of the canonical works of art and canonical artists through this time period. And so, this is the amount of time we have to spend on this. There are, however, I want to alert you, many classes on African American arts and culture at the University of Washington and beyond. In my own teaching, especially with African American or black arts from about 1960 forward, I teach at least 3 different courses on this, including another survey course, the Art History 270 course that is on art and identity politics, in which black contemporary artists get a little bit more analysis. Okay, so a little kind of caveat here, I suppose, to get us started. First thing I want to say, though, is that as we have been talking at least a little bit about how difficult it would be as a woman to be an artist during the 19th century, this is even more the case, frankly, for black artists. Or African American artists. We're going to use those terms interchangeably today, by the way, for many of the same reasons, right? Up until the Civil War, the vast majority of African Americans in the United States, and again, most of these are slaves, so I'm not sure you can even call them African Americans. I hesitate to use that term because people weren't thinking of them as American citizens or at least large groups were not. And so, obviously you're not going to be an accomplished artist or have a whole lot of time on your hands to take classes and create art. And if you happen to be in the North, a lot of the venues, which are minimal, of course, through the 19th century to study arts, are not going to be open to you as well, either because of financial situations or, frankly, because of racism that even, of course, in the North is very, very well established and implicit almost everywhere. Now, this isn't to say, of course, that African Americans or even slaves didn't practice various forms of art. They, of course, did. Creativity, it seems to me, is an almost universal thing that all humans have in them. Even if you think that, you couldn't draw anything, I bet you anything, you've got some area of your life or some interest that involves creativity, whether it be music or, the clothes you wear or whatever it might be, right? So it's around us all over. But to become a professional artist or to become recognized or to sell your works of art, that's another story. And that's one of those doors that is absolutely closed to African Americans and only, partially open to various other minorities, including women, through the 19th century. After the Civil War, of course, in fits and starts, because things don't just change as we've seen all at once, more doors start opening. And part of the reason for that, of course, is that we will see, and especially through the storytelling works of Jacob Lawrence, after whom the Jacob Lawrence Gallery in the School of Art is named, because Jacob Lawrence, for a time at the end of his life, taught at the University of Washington. We will hear about the Great Migrations, or what's often known as the Negro migrations from the South to the North. Now, these tend to really get going around 1916 all the way through the 1970s or so. but the first kind of minor waves of migration north happen in the 19th century, where African Americans are seeking to find new economic opportunities, as well as to escape a very, very racist South following the Civil War. In any case, that's part of the context. The other part of the context that we'll see coming up is the rise of what in general gets called the New Negro movement, later known as the Harlem Renaissance. But that's right around the turn of the century. So before we get there, let's talk about a kind of onesie, twosie, and meaning artists who, I don't want to call them token artists because they're not token artists, but the few black artists that are able to kind of find a way through the system and achieve some measure of success in their own professional artistry. And the exemplary artist in this vein is Henry Ossawa Tanner. And you're looking at here his famous The Banjo lesson that is reproduced in your textbook. Tanner studied under Thomas Eakins at the Pennsylvania Academy to the Arts. Eakins, I think I made mention before, he had a couple of qualities that frankly aren't so great if you look into him in detail, but being open to teaching both women and people of color and not showing great degrees of racism, although apparently he wasn't all that tolerant of women from time to time, is something we can credit to him as well. Tanner, for his part, and this is absolutely important to mention, I think, was of mixed race, as many people were, but he was a fairly light-skinned African American. And I bring this up because it tends to be the case even today, and it was certainly the case in the 19th century into the early 20th, that the lighter your skin was, the more likely you are going to be tolerated, although not treated as an equal, by white culture in the United States. He, so he did his training at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Arts. Then he took what I think is almost a obligatory trip to Europe if you're going to be a professional artist, you have any ambition. Between 1891 and 93, he travels through Paris, and he studies with some pretty big people in Paris, and he also gets a flavor of the art scene. When he returns to the United States, though, the thing that seems to have stuck with him, believe it or not, in his style, and I'll get to the subject matter here in a minute, is that he has seen a number of painters, particularly old masters, that he responds to, perhaps even more than the modern artists that were working at the time. Now, combined with the major master he's interested in, Rembrandt van Rijn, are some of the moves in Impressionism in which you have very, very loose brushstroke, as we say, very, very, painterly quality. It simply means that if you were to look at this up close, and you can probably tell even on the small version on your screen, that it's not crisp, sharp detail, that we can still see the brushstrokes on the canvas itself, that the lines, the contour lines at the edges of figures are fairly blurry. Later, Rembrandt does this quite a bit, and of course the Impressionists are doing this all the time. And it's something he's affected in his style. He's also copied something of the kind of non-rational light sources that you get up a Rembrandt. If you look here, maybe there's a window off in the space over here shining in the background on the wall, but it's not clear why it doesn't illuminate more of the older man's face, for instance. Now, that's hardly the major part of this. Tanner was actually commissioned by a very well-intentioned kind of liberal man who ran a foundation to create images, or rather he was going to be paid to create images of the folk life of black people. This was meant to humanize African Americans, right? To treat them in ways that run counter to the stereotypes of blacks at the time, and he's certainly done that here. He's taken the stereotype of the black minstrel, right? The high-stepping, banjo-playing kind of entertainer that we've seen a couple of times so far in this class, and instead of, parodying this or even kind of mimicking it, he's changed it. what he's done is he's taken a grandfather, and in the grandfather's lap, in a very intimate way, the grandson is learning how to play the banjo. It is a moment of tenderness. It's a moment of familial connection, right? So that's in here. We think of them as real subjects, as real human beings, rather than some kind of stereotype. The other thing, though, that's going on here is a little bit of it's almost like an implicit message that at the time everyone would have recognized. The banjo itself is very, at this time, well, certainly earlier in the 19th century, very closely associated with black culture. There's lots of historical information that the banjo actually comes from various stringed instruments in Africa. So it's one of these connective tissues or kind of ethnic traditions that transcends the diaspora, the taking of these people as slaves. They fashion instruments that then later become things like the banjo. Now, it's not exactly the same as the original instrument, but it's absolutely derivative of these instruments. So it shows a connection to past ethnicity. The other thing, though, that's going on here that your text goes into quite nicely is that at the end of the 19th century, a lot of basically entrepreneurs were seeking to elevate banjo playing and banjo music. And they, formerly, the way that you would play a banjo that's associated with kind of African American culture or slave culture is to strum the instrument. These entrepreneurs tried to kind of elevate it, associate it with new forms of music at the time. And they basically played it much more like you would play a guitar by plucking the strings both from the bottom, right, pulling up, as well as from the top down. And that's important here because that begins to be associated with, right, these white entrepreneurs seeking to elevate, supposedly, this music and this instrument from black culture, which it's primarily associated with. And here we have a young kid who's basically affecting those new techniques as if to say something like, this isn't beyond black culture, and frankly, we're claiming this instrument and this tradition and these sounds back for our own. Now, Tanner does something that is, let's say, really, for the most part, accepted by mainstream culture. He takes things that you might have seen before, and for instance, scenes from the Civil War, some of those kind of genre scenes of black culture that we looked at during that lecture, and he continues that, but he makes them even more intimate. In other words, he's not showing you African American anger at mistreatment, and he's not showing you blacks in a way that makes you super uncomfortable, right? There's a feeling of promise, of hope, even if you see scenes like this, The Thankful Poor, in which they have very, very meager housing. Their meal looks pretty light as well. There's no indication of prosperity. What you get are blacks enduring. And this, frankly, is one of the really common thematics in African American art and African American artists representing the history of African American culture. That through adversity, through, of course, enduring adversity, we become stronger as a people. We have, we've made it through slavery, and yes, things are hard now, but it's just making us stronger. The other thing is that is a kind of common thread here that's an interesting one, and it's been talked about by quite a few historians over the years, is that, of course, black culture was forced to African American culture, slave culture, was forced to submit to Christian teachings, and yet, of course, Christianity is a mainstay of a lot of black cultural traditions today. And so here we see these African Americans, again, very, very poor, but thankful for what they have, turning to religion, something that originally was forced upon them, but now has become something that universalizes humanity, that makes blacks for blacks or African Americans, humans just like whites are. And again, when I emphasize this, this is kind of one of what we would call a middle ground. It's not something that emphasizes anger or shows you black culture so poor that it's intolerable for us to look at, that we feel bad for them, and we recognize that there's a major flaw in inner society that allows certain people access to wealth and others not. This is kind of even Steven, so to speak. By the way, later in his life, as you'll read in the text, Tanner moves away from that. It's only a couple-year period that he creates those kind of genre scenes, and he starts doing religious works over and again. This is an artist that's not shown in your textbook, so I just want to spend a couple minutes on him, but he's an example. This is Horace Pippin. He's an example of many black artists who were not formally trained in any real way. In other words, they didn't have the money or didn't have the access to an art school or even kind of secondary art teaching for various reasons. In the case of Horace Pippin here, he has zero money, right? He doesn't have any money at all. He had a very rough childhood, as many do. Little schooling. His parents were domestic servants. And then he goes off to World War I, and his right arm, which is his dominant arm, was destroyed in the war. When he came back, he turned to artistry in order to, as you see here, this one's called End of War, Starting Home, from around 1931, to document his experience of the war in a very simple, what we call naive manner of painting. Naive just simply means, basically self-taught. He is doing things, I want to show you this work because there's tons of African-American artists who did this, who didn't have a lot of schooling, just did their own work and had a moderate amount of success. Pippin's maybe the most successful of this group of artists. So he's needing to represent his story, needing to represent his experience, and he does it through visual arts. These are oftentimes, by the way, wood panels that have been painted over very roughly. He'll oftentimes take a hot poker. You may be able to kind of make this out a little bit. This is actually relief back here. He takes a hot poker and burns the wood to create a kind of light relief on the surface and then paints over the top, in this case of a victory over the German forces. Horace Pippin is also well known for, and this is key to African American arts, to representing the African experience, to representing a history of African Americans or issues that were important to African Americans that are either not being represented by mainstream artists who are white, or are being represented, frankly, according to the perspectives of white, which in the worst case scenario are gross, simplistic, and oftentimes derogatory stereotypes, and in the best of circumstances are a white artist telling a black person's story. So in this case, you're looking at one of a series of works on John Brown. This is John Brown Goes to His Hanging. Remember, John Brown was the abolitionist who led a revolt, or he was trying to start a slave revolt by attacking Harper's Ferry, an armory, in order to kind of start what eventually becomes the Civil War. This happens right on the eve of the Civil War. And he fails, he's captured, and he's hung. Here you see, in a kind of very simple, naive way, John Brown, who has been roped up here. He's right in the center, on his way to his hanging, with people, many of whom are whites and a few of whom are African Americans, witnessing this scene. This, by the way, in the far right-hand corner is a portrait of his grandmother, who witnessed John Brown going to his hanging and told Horace Pippin the story of this, described it to him, which then he describes to us in this visual form. It's very simple because he hasn't been taught much, but it's also very simple because he's primarily trying to represent his culture's history, the history of, in this case, abolitionist movements, and a white man that sought to help out black culture. He has taken stories that his grandmothers told him and turned it into a visual form as if to fill a gap in American history. One more work by Horace Pippin here. This is Supper Time. And again, very meager supper. By the way, I mean, these things are very cool to see firsthand. He's just using thrown away material. So it's a board that he has burned, if you follow my cursor here, to create cabinets off to the side. And he's kind of ingeniously made this board through not even true perspective, but just in the way he orients the figures, look like it's jutting out into our space and becomes a tabletop, and then paints it in such a way as to show this fairly meager existence, right? Hanging your clothes over here, not much on the table, people still dressed in servants' clothes. But it has a certain degree of, I don't know, it's to me it's pretty, right? The aesthetic qualities of this are nice. The blue and the peach off to the other side are quite vibrant colors. The white really pops out. It gives it a certain amount of, I want to say, dignity, or it shows, again, black culture enduring some of their hardships and still having some kind of glimmer of hope or a glimmer of dignity or something to be commended, I suppose. And that's, again, a very common thread, particularly in African American arts, let's say up through the Civil Rights Movement. So even though Horace Pippin is working at a time in which this has already occurred, I saved telling you the history of the rise of the New Negro movement until we got to this artist, Aaron Douglas, because it doesn't quite affect someone like Horace Pippin, or at least not directly. Now, your text goes into this in more detail than I have time to do here, but there's no reason for me to narrate something that you can read anyway. So let me just give you the quick version of this. In 1903, a very famous text is published called The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois, who is, of course, a major black activist, trained at Harvard, is someone who picks up on some of the threads of black activism following the Civil War and pushes those forward towards basically what he's arguing. If I can summarize this great text that I think everyone should have to read, and it's a great read, it gives you some insight into this period, is that blacks are people too. When he says in the title, Black Soul, on the one hand, he's saying something like there is a kind of essence to black culture and black ethnicity, and he's using that term, right? This is one of the first kind of widespread use of the term black in order to identify a people, in opposition to white, or rather to say they have their own cultural traditions, they have their own spirit, their own soul, their own connections going all the way back to black Africa, and they are people with souls, right? The soul can be something that has multiple different resonances for us, but when he uses that term, it has that religious connotation that, let's say, a lot of racist people might think, well, blacks don't have souls, they're not real humans, and he is using that to say there's this connective tissue between all people. Blacks have souls like white people, and he's also using it in the way that you would use soul in terms of, let's say, soul music, or soul meaning some kind of deep, essential qualities to being black. In his way of thinking about this, it has to do with a shared heritage going all the way back to cultures in Africa. Over time, W.E.B. Du Bois' writings, as well as many others, get picked up by later major players in the field of black activism, including, for instance, famously Alan Locke, who coins the term the New Negro movement, Langston Hughes, and the rise of the Harlem Renaissance, of course, which is not really only located in Harlem, but is meant to talk about the new social consciousness of African Americans, a new call to educate, to be politically conscious, to rise up and bond together in response to racial inequities in the United States. The Harlem Renaissance, as it's known, or the New Negro Movement, is it's really, really closely associated with interest in arts, interest in culture. Culture, particularly for people like Alan Locke, is a way towards liberation. He is thinking in terms of, he is absolutely supportive of modern art, is Locke, and is Langston Hughes and many others, as liberated, as not tied to past conventions, as something that is a free-form expression of the individual. And so he thinks of art in general as a liberating force, but he also pushes the idea of modern arts. And we see this a little bit here with Aaron Douglas's work. It's called Ma Bad Luck Card from 1826. When he created this work, he was actually illustrating he's creating an illustration for Langston Hughes's Hard Luck, an essay that was published in Opportunity, which was a periodical of the Harlem Renaissance that was actually funded by the Urban League. Some of you know the Urban League. It's still around today in some forms. Was founded to help black migrants from the South. Remember, these major migrations happened in 1916 to adjust to the reality of northern city life. And this periodical was a place for many of the literary figures to publish their essays. It was also a place for artists to publish, in this case, a print that has something to do with that. So what I want to say here is that what you're witnessing in this work is an artist who's deeply influenced by modern art at the time. He's simplified or abstracted form down to its essences. He's using, and you'll see this again, that kind of profile of a black man with the white eyes and a little bit, let's say, larger lips, which was earlier a stereotype, but in this case it's been filtered through his study of African mass in particular. He met Albert Barnes of the Barnes Foundation, who let him examine his collection of African American arts. He's, in this case, using those African American art mass in order to create a kind of composite or very universal image of a black man and black women as well in his works of art. This is a bit different than what happens when modern artists in Europe in particular are influenced by African arts, in particular African mass. Some of you know Matisse and Picasso and Gauguin and many others are influenced by their experience of African mass. But those European artists tend to be drawn to the simplicity of form, the expressive potential of these masks. They don't think very much about how it's connected to a real human culture. And Aaron Douglas here is kind of having it both ways. He's interested in the expressive potential of that mask, but he's also recognizing that those masks are products of a culture from which, at least sometime in his deep heritage, he came. Now, I'm not going to go into the ins and outs of how this might be associated with the essay. The essay has to do with, of course, all of the obstacles and, frankly, mistakes that are made by a black man. But hopefully you see this kind of dynamic illustration, something that shows you, a black man that looks a little different than the earlier stereotype, something that is a composite image of a card up in the right upper hand side, and then some very jagged forms that will be associated with, of course, energy or some kind of conflict that this man has come into contact with. And this is just one form of his art. These prints that he made, this is another print called Flight. Again, he has studied African art forms. You see a simplification of a black man, one presumes fleeing some kind of racial subjugation or even fleeing from the South. There are all of these, just to, again, get us very comfortable with formal analysis. It's black and white, so really, really stark contrasts here. Those stark contrasts are going to work on us in a way that your eye pops back and forth between the positive, meaning the black forms, and the negative space, the space that supposedly surrounds them. And that creates a kind of energy in the work. That everything's set up on diagonals with sharp points on it. Those are things that are aggressive forms, aren't they? They're things that make us feel like, there's this figure is in some degree of peril, even if we can't recognize what exactly those forms are. Remember, modern artists are less interested, for the most part, in recognizable forms and very interested in manipulating form in order to directly affect us through the effects of the formal elements. So something like high contrast, sharp forms, lots of diagonals, these are all things that are working to create some anxiety in this. We also see, of course, the man running, but it's been greatly exaggerated, hasn't it? Those legs are too wide. He's completely off the ground. That is something that's going to emphasize that flight that is occurring here. And then you see at the bottom more organic forms associated with leaves or ground or a stream. It gives you an indication of where we are, either the jungle or the deep south or something like that. And then finally, notice how this form occurs here, where you've got a sharp form. We don't know what this is exactly, but it juts into the man's midsection. And in order to make it stand out and to really emphasize it, we have a reversal of the black into the white as it cuts into this black man. Or defiance here, right? Same types of things working. He did a lot of these prints. A lot of these prints were sold independently, but there were also things that were published in periodicals, including the periodical Opportunity. He also did major paintings. He is right in the midst of the Harlem Renaissance. During his formative years, he had grown up in Nebraska, believe it or not, and at age 24 comes to Harlem, but he's right in the midst of the rise of the new Negro movement and the Harlem Renaissance, and he's rubbing shoulders with and exchanging stories and ideas with these major artists and literary figures. This is just an example of one of his major paintings. This is Harriet Tubman from 1931. Again, representing black history, representing key heroic characters from black history is a major component of African American arts in the new Negro movement all the way up into the contemporary moment, frankly. Harriet Tubman, of course, being a key character in this history, a woman who escaped the South only to return to the South and to help free slaves. And she returned over and over again despite the peril that she was putting herself in, establishing as well what was known as the Underground Railroad, which is not, of course, literally underground, but a series of hidden kind of hideaway spots and transition or trails, roadways, ways to move slaves from the South into the North in order to save them from all the perils, including slavery in the South. So what we see here is in the center a picture of Harriet Tubman, again, as a silhouette. He's seen those masks. He's using kind of the expressive simplicity of those masks in order to say black woman, right? Powerful, hands in the air, fist raised, breaking those chains. She is highlighted by the light, the target of the concentric circles here, and we're not sure, of course, what these are supposed to be. Is this, the light source itself? Maybe, but in a way it doesn't matter. It's just meant to draw attention to her. And then we see this concentric circles here showing you the cannon fire, the perils that they are faced with. Again, bringing us into the center. And people from all around either coming to pay their homage to her or seek their help so as to move from, again, the leaf or greenery of the Great South into the Promised Land, which is the North, referenced by these two high rises that look a little bit like some kind of biblical tale. Or this work, another one of his major paintings, Negro in an African Setting from 1934. Again, he's influenced by African arts that he's seen in Albert Barnes' collection. You know, these hairstyles, these silhouettes obviously are going to make us think about African culture. He's also showing you the spirit of African culture, the dance. These types of representations of African culture that will continue all the way through the civil rights movement into today are ways that these cultures, and it's not just African American or black culture, it's also Native American culture and many other cultures, seek to renew connections to their ethnic histories, seek to revitalize those connections to histories that were broken, or at least partially broken and disrupted by, of course, slavery, by the diaspora. And so here you see him reclaiming this ancestry through this picture of kind of the spirit of black culture transcending slavery, transcending all of the prejudices that blacks have faced, and it's kind of joyous moment here. So a couple of kind of quick ones on the same set of ideas. This is Palmer Hayden's work, Fetish and Fleurs. Fetish et Fleurs, that just means fetish and flowers. Palmer Hayden was, he, like most, went to Paris in order to continue his training. He was, later on, as you'll see, paid by a major collector, a philanthropist, in order to create scenes of everyday black culture or the lives of everyday black people. When he has traveled to Paris and kind of learned from the modern style, he has, of course, seen these artists who are interested in these African masks, and he's done a little bit of that here. He's just put one of those masks. In this case, it's a Fang mask, or at least it looks like one, Fang, from Gabon culture, Gabon. And he's set it up along with these flowers as if it's a still life. But there's a little bit more going on here. It's a still life, meaning just an arrangement of objects that artists use all the time in order to train themselves or in order to show some kind of skill. But he's associated flowers, or kind of the natural world, and flowering, meaning something that's fertile and growing and thriving, along with this symbol of African heritage or his connection to African heritage. When he is paid by the Harmon Foundation in order to create these scenes of the daily lives of African Americans in a folk style, this is what he turns to. This is Midsummer Night in Harlem from 1936. I'm sorry, I jumped over this too quick. I should also say that there's a raffia, a Bakuba raffia cloth here. This is also an African element that he's put on the table. Sorry about that. So, Midsummer Night in Harlem, he returns to something that a lot of people have found a little bit problematic. In order to represent the idea of the universal African American, he has returned to these racial stereotypes, and it's something that, on the one hand, one can understand what he's trying to do. In order to show you a Midsummer Night in Harlem, this is almost a little bit like the Cliff Dwellers. He's showing you the people of the time sitting on their stoops, having conversations, crowding the windows. You can almost get the feeling of people talking. So we've got these kind of high-rise brownstones next to each other, people out on their stoop, as I said, which is, of course, part of urban culture, but especially part of black urban culture, in which, in order to congregate, not having other venues that might be open to the more affluent, people congregate on their steps, on their stoops, in their windows, on the streets, right, on the corners. This is the place that you don't have to pay anything to go, and yet you can still kind of build community. In the background over here, you see a church, another symbol, of course, of the things that unify black culture. And in order to, again, push this unity a little bit more, he affects some of those kinds of simplistic representations of black, meaning super white eyes, super white teeth, a little bit larger noses and mouths, And frankly, there's very little attention to individual features, and instead they all become a type. Again, his goal is to show community or connection, but it runs pretty close to reducing everyone to a kind of stereotype. And as many people have pointed out, it's pretty close to all those representations of blacks that you saw by white culture, pre-Civil War through Civil War, that are quite problematic. Much more of an individual representation of blacks throughout his work is Archibald Motley Jr., although I should say that in a couple of his scenes from Paris, we get kind of stereotypes, but I'm not showing you those. This is a work that's called Mending Socks from 1924. Again, Archibald Motley Jr. was someone who was basically trained. He was part of the Harlem Renaissance, and in this case, he is showing you a scene that looks like a kind of typical straightforward genre scene of an older African-American woman, bending socks. It takes a few minutes before you see really some of the hidden part of this. As I said, you get not a stereotype here. There's a very individual, specific face, right, with all the folds and wrinkles and posture, grayness in the hair, whatever there. And then off to the left-hand side, you see an oil portrait on the wall, and you see a pretty nice interior. And you have to ask yourself, in 1924, whose house is she in? Because it's not her house, likely. And that then leads you to acknowledge that she is a domestic servant and one of many women who would have found themselves in roles not so different than the roles that they played when they were slaves, mending someone else's socks perhaps, wearing her apron, a symbol of servitude, and of course all that fruit on the table is not necessarily hers to have, nor are the books that she may or may not be able to read, frankly, probably not. And the half face of the portrait is probably, the woman of the house who is here even when she's not here. It shows you half of that portrait to say something like she's always present in the consciousness of this woman, even when she's not physically present here. And then very closely represented by the black woman is the crucifix in between the white woman and the black woman, a symbol of what? Their shared humanity, their shared religious affiliations, or is it something to say, it's hard to miss how white he has rendered Christ. Is this something else that is being referenced here? I could show you a lot of works by Richmond Barthé, such as this one, The African Dancer from 1933. Again, Richmond Barthé was trained as an artist, had a lot of connections to the Harlem Renaissance. He was an incredibly popular artist that tended to show scenes that are not specific to African American culture in the United States, but rather have something to do with the spirit of African ancestry. So African Dancer, a woman caught in the trance of dance, something that is acceptable to artistry, even though she doesn't have clothes on, because by this point you've got representations in photography of African cultures not wearing their clothes, showing up in things that will later become National Geographic. And also, of course, this is something that's fairly common in the tradition of classical sculpture. What I'm getting at here is that he's picking a subject or a series of subjects in sculpture that add a certain degree of ethnic specificity to the bodies of the figures, but also partake of some of the earlier traditions of classical sculptures representing the nude. They're not so specific as to, again, be caught up in some of the issues that would be involved in representing blacks in the United States, meaning this is off there in Africa, and yet they'll appeal to both African Americans and whites in the United States, in the sense that for blacks, these things are associated with this connection to earlier African cultures, the interest and importance of spirituality in contemporary African American cultures, interest in dance and music in African American cultures, interest in just general spirituality as well. It's incredibly popular. Again, haven't been spending a ton of time on sculpture just because, well, for two big reasons. One is that we just don't have enough time to spend on everything. And number two is that sculpture doesn't reproduce as well in a slide lecture as paintings do. But this is Sargent Johnson's Forever Free, again, a trained artist, but one who affected a more folk approach to sculpture, one that is not coming from those classical traditions. He was less popular than someone like Richmond Barthé, but he did sell his work quite well. And here you've got a work that's called Forever Free. Hopefully you can see this. It's a representation of a black woman who is really represented in the same way that you might represent those Native Americans, Charles Bird King, or those noblemen from Europe that I said that whole tradition comes from. She's kind of like the noble savage again, or rather I should put it this way so as not to confuse you. She's represented according to the conventions that were representations of white noblemen and then got applied to Native Americans to say there's something noble in them. And here we have it in a black woman who looks slightly above our eye level, whose head is tilted up proudly, who has this kind of very statuesque, strong form to her. And then brilliantly, in my opinion, these two children are actually relief carvings into her skirt, reaching around. There's one on each side to touch each other and standing on her feet, as if to say something like, this connective tissue of all black people to their shared ancestry will be continued with the next generation and the next generation and the next. I'm going to pause here just for a quick break for myself, and I'll be right back. So, I'm going to move on now to a major artist who is involved in all of these things we've been talking about so far, the Harlem Renaissance, representing aspects of African American history, sometimes connections to that ancestry that goes back to Africa, ethnic traditions, and someone that in the Northwest we have a connection with because he taught at the University of Washington near the end of his career. This is Jacob Lawrence, of course. Jacob Lawrence was associated, let's say moderately indirectly, not in the same way that Aaron Douglas or Palmer Hayden or Archibald Motley Jr. was, with the Harlem Renaissance. He moved from Philadelphia to Harlem a bit later in 1930. He took his first lessons in art around that same time period from Charles Alston at the Utopia House, which was not quite the same as not the center of the Harlem Renaissance. Not that this matters much at all, but it's just worth mentioning. In 32 to 34, he was involved in a program that was developed under the Works Progress Administration. If you don't know about this, you'll hear about this a little bit more when we get to the next lecture, which is in the 1930s, of course, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, along with the government, of course, established the Works Progress Administration in order to help combat the effects of the Great Depression. And components of that were devoted to helping to put artists back to work and to train artists. And so one part of the WP program was the Harlem Art Workshop between 1932 and 1934, where he worked. And then later on in his career, in the late 30s, Jacob Lawrence was actually part of what's known as the easel painting program, part of the Federal Arts Project, where he was paid a very nominal amount to just work as an artist, whether he was getting paid or not. In any case, Jacob Lawrence is a major player in this story for me because he melds together this interest in telling stories about African American experience or the experience of blacks and their history through his paintings, and he weds that storytelling, that interest in representing black history with various kind of elements that are associated with modernism, but in his own very particular way. Almost, I shouldn't say all, but most of his really famous works of art come from long series. So what you're looking at here is one painting from a series on Toussaint Louverture, who was a Haitian slave who fought against the French in the late 18th century and led Haiti to freedom in the early 19th century. This is one of a series of works. I don't remember exactly how many are in this series. His series tend to run from the mid-30s up until 35, 36 or so in a series, up to 60 plus in a series. But in this part of the series, what we're looking at is the slave owner, or the person who is forcing the slaves to work in the fields, pushing it so far that the slaves will eventually revolt. And that's actually the title of this one. It basically is the cruelty, and by the way, every one of his titles, I haven't reproduced them on your handout because I'd run out of space in no time, but they're long titles. They can be even a paragraph long, very descriptive, telling you what you're seeing, so as to add a kind of narrative, literary element to the visuals that you're looking at. So this one is the cruelty of the slave owners led the slaves to revolt in 1776, and then later led to the overall, and these revolts continued, and then later led to the revolution that established, by the way, Haiti as the first black state. That's one of the reasons that a lot of these artists turn to Haiti, or that Haiti is so important to people. The revolt of the slaves that ends up overturning the French colonial government in the early 19th century is the establishment of the first diasporic black state. So that's one of the big importances here. Now, what I want to focus on in this, and you can apply it to the rest of the works too, is that on the one hand, we've got, again, this story told both in the title of the work as well as the visuals of the work that tells you something about the black experience, in this case, Toussaint Louverture, this major revolutionary who leads Haiti to a revolt, and frankly, the establishment of the first black state. And along with that, though, you see that he's not really trying to accurately represent in a photorealistic way either people or the scenery. What he's doing is he's simplifying or abstracting form down to things that really tell you the story quite directly. He's basically taken all the elements that are the most important elements, and he's reduced the painting to those, and then he's rendered it in a way so as to express the most important aspects of this. So you see the white, again, slave owner who's got the Christian cross on his bodice here. So we've associated him with this idea of blacks are somehow spiritually backwards. We're a Christian, that gives us the right for colonialism and owning other people. He's made him incredibly white, dressed him in white, and then, of course, has this cane in his hand and a very dynamic pose to his arm, extreme pose to the cane as well, coming down to slash the back of the black man, who is bound hand and foot, face turned away, prostrate on the ground, and so you just kind of tell that story as quickly as you can with a simplicity of means. We've also set this somewhere in a kind of tropical setting with the reeds in the background, green blues. We've got, the sky back there that's quite ominous and black, the rising moon off to the right, and then huddled in the foreground in order to impress upon us the masses of people that were held as slaves, the simplified form. But again, if you could see this a little bit more clearly, they're not quite all the same, of blacks huddled together, eyes now wide open in fear, shackled in this way. So one after another of his works are on basically African American history, and the one that I've chosen to focus on most here is this one, the Negro Migration series. In the Negro Migration series, again, we have over 50 works in this entire series. What Jacob Lawrence is trying to tell us about is the history of the Negro Migration, or the Great Migration, which between the years of 1916 and 1970, over 6 million African Americans migrated from the South to the North, in particular the Northeast, so areas like, for instance, New York and Harlem and so forth. And some of the reasons that this occurred, some of the people who came, what the waves of migration were like, and so forth. Now, he's primarily talking about what historians sometimes call the first Great Migration, which are the years of basically 1916 up to 1940, in which the numbers are still extreme, at 1.6 million, which, by the way, his family was a part of. And again, the titles of these works are telling. I didn't put them all in your handout, but I will read some of these out for you, at least a shortened version of this. This is the first of the entire series, and its title is During the World War, There's a Great Migration North by Southern Negroes. So starting at the beginning of the First World War, Great Migration occurs. And here you see people going through various gates to go to various parts of particularly the Northwest, but you also see St. Louis and Chicago in here as well. And why are they doing this? Other parts of this story will tell you why. Because there's not much opportunity in the South, right? There's economic opportunity, and there's a great deal of racism. So there are, of course, hopefully greener pastures, so to speak, in other parts of the North. And here, once again, you see a kind of simplicity of form. He's now avoided all racial stereotypes. He's just giving you these, an indication of various different people wearing slightly different clothing, going through different gates to get to different parts of the United States. When asked about his work and what he was trying to achieve, Jacob Lawrence said, if I've achieved a degree of success as a creative artist, it is mainly due to the Black experience, which is our heritage, an experience which gives inspiration, motivation, and stimulation. I was inspired by the Black aesthetic by which we are surrounded, motivated to manipulate form, color, space, line, and texture to depict our life, and stimulated by the beauty and poignancy of our environment. Now, what he's getting at there is something that he said in other parts of various interviews too, some of which little snippets are in the extra videos that I've given you, which is he shows you a kind of vibrant scene, a simple scene of bright colors, oftentimes in simple forms, mainly in movement, because he sees this as part of the Black experience. He associates kind of, I would say, kind of standard tonalities or things that are kind of simplified harmonies of color more with white culture, and Black culture being more flamboyant, more intense, frankly, more movement oriented. And he saw those, by the way, as many people would point out, in many of the fabrics in particular that come from African cultures. So here is number 2 in the series. The migrants arrived in great numbers. And so again, It's just visual storytelling. Groups of families, individually represented, walking, moving their way towards their tomorrow. This one is titled, "And They Were Very Poor," right? So it's not clear whether this is when they're still in the south or when they get to the north, but nonetheless, they're still very poor, and that, is something that will tell you one of the reasons that they leave, but also some of the hardships that they still face when they get to the north. And again, he doesn't, in a simplicity of form, just simplifying things down to their basics, with a pan hanging on the wall and a couple of, plates or bowls in front of these figures, but nothing else. He's able to show you their meager subsistence. But then again, along with that, you see these bold colors in here. And even though they look down now, that's supposed to kind of call out to us and say there is this shared heritage going back to African culture. And we have faced adversity before, and we face it now, and we will get through it, even in the toughest moments. So this one has a really long title, and it's about the race riots in the North that were caused because of conflicts between Negroes, what he calls African American culture, Negroes and whites, who were oftentimes fighting for the same jobs. These race wars, by the way, because black culture didn't have a whole lot of access to, or at least not the same access to employment and wealth opportunities, during the various strikes that occurred, oftentimes blacks were brought in and promised great amounts of money, sometimes not paid that, by the way, by the factory owners in order to break the strikes. And this, of course, leads to massive conflict, fuels conflict that's probably already simmering between blacks and whites. And here you see that riot with in the foreground, a white man, again, simplified into this very dynamic form, wide open mouth here, exaggerated as if yelling, the hair turned into very sharp shapes that have red in them. Up above that, behind him, another figure holding a red stick in his hand, and behind that, another figure holding what looks like a knife. And the whole perspective set up askew as if to give us an idea of turmoil and, something that we can't quite, like in the midst of a fight, you can't quite orient yourself because you're in it as well. And then just, again, back to parts of this story, this is about the Negro professional who was one of the last to leave the South. Having already made it, of course, the Negro professional here, a doctor, doesn't have a whole lot of, there's not a lot of reason to move up to the North. You're probably going to find yourself in competition with white doctors, and as a black doctor, that might be difficult. And besides, you've already kind of made it, but after your clientele, most of your clientele has moved up north, you've got to move up north too, and that's part of his title. So here we see that black doctor, again, treating a black patient, wearing a stethoscope, but look at how Jacob Lawrence has changed this stethoscope to look really big, and it's a little bit of an allusion to a hangman's noose and that deep history that is being referenced here. And then just a final one to throw in here. This is the female worker was one of the last to leave. It's number 57 in the series of, I think it's 58 or 60 in this series. In any case, again, black servants, women in particular, especially unattached women, are going to continue to work in the South, be some of the last to leave because the economic opportunities for them in the North are not much better, and they don't have the support system to move up north if they don't have connections to wider families. And so here you see her toiling away, continuing to work. Again, very simplicity of a form here, something that is meant to show you something of her strength and endurance, with that very, very vertical, upright, whatever she's using to stir the laundry down here below. She seems to be washing rugs, if you see that in the background. and part of that African American story. Again, he did tons of these series. So I'll just point to one more before moving on to the next artist and say, to emphasize this common theme. This is one of the Harriet Tubman series, a whole series on this woman that we've already talked about here. And this one's called Harriet Grow Bigger, Harriet Grow Stronger. Again, it tells the story of her childhood through her working with the Underground Railroad. And this one, you see her, again, the title is Harriet Grow Bigger, Harriet Grow Stronger, doing manual labor with these huge hands in a very, very kind of monumental form, right? The big, huge shoulders, everything set up on a diagonal, really emphasizes her strength and monumentality. But the title here is not just meant to reference, if she does manual labor, she's going to get big muscles. It's meant to reference that idea that through struggles against adversity, Black culture in general is getting stronger and stronger. It's through, that ability to overcome that Black culture and Black shared experience keeps growing and keeps, frankly, moving to the next stage. Just again, to emphasize the fact that a lot of Black artists, all the way through from the time of the Harlem Renaissance through the 1960s, were interested in exploring some of the artistic forms of African cultures. I bring in a couple of works by Lois Mailou Jones. Lois Mailou Jones was married to a Haitian man. She was educated at Ivy League schools. She made numerous trips to Africa and lived for most of her life on and off between the United States and Haiti. And many of her works are these beautiful abstract representations that were inspired by various African arts. This one's called Les Fétiches. It just means fetishes, another term for an African mask. A fetish, by the way, for those of you who've never come across this term, is originally an anthropological term applied to, in particular, primitive or traditional cultures is what we would call them today, who believe that various objects actually have their own intrinsic power to them. And this is a term that was applied to a number of arts that came from Africa by early anthropologists. So that's where you get that term. And again, you see mass and some kind of sculpture and another mass perhaps below this, all rendered in these abstract patterns from a woman who is interested in making these connections between her deep ancestry in Africa and her current experience. And here's just another one. This one's called Initiation, Liberia. She had a long career, and this is from the 1980s here. Same thing, a figure, a Black woman, rendered fairly realistically, but turned into a mask, both with the head covering as well as the profiles off to the side, and then indications of what I was trying to say before, these abstract patterns that show up maybe most commonly. You'll recognize them in kente cloth, but down here below, abstract patterns of very, very bold colors that are a common occurrence in African arts, something that Jacob Lawrence was trying to draw attention to or make connections to through his very, very bold, simple, and intense colors. Last artist for today, just to kind of bring us into the 1960s and more kind of cutting edge, frankly, avant-garde types of artists, is this man. This is Romare Bearden. Romare Bearden is, again, I just want to give you a kind of introduction to where some African American or Black arts go. Romare Bearden was actually trained by a number of very famous artists, including George Grosz. George Grosz was a German Dada artist who ended up teaching in the United States when he escaped Germany because of the rise of fascism, who probably explained to Romare Bearden all of the things that Dada artists were trying to do, which have to do with using art to raise consciousness about various issues. And what you're looking at here is a work that is called The Conjure Woman. That's actually a collage, or sometimes these are called photo montages. In other words, he's just taken photos and kind of cut them up and pasted them back together, which was a favorite technique of the Dadaists. It was one of their ways of talking about, and for Romare Bearden this is even more the case, that our identity or our sense of self, and in this case Black identity, is made up of lots of different historical memories. So the photographs are disparate little pieces that are brought together into one place, just like all of us are, kind of composite of all of our ancestry, our history, our family connections, our cultural connections, and so forth. Before talking about this specifically, let me just give you a little bit more about Romare Bearden to kind of flesh out this context. He was a key member of a group known as the Spiral Group, who were very socially oriented Black activists during the rise of the of the 1960s kind of social civil rights movements, who discussed the possibility of arts being used to help kind of move society forward. His mother was a major political figure in terms of the civil rights movement and women's rights as well. So he grew up in a very kind of socially conscious age. He was very interested in something that is probably, I could have brought up as early as the Harlem Renaissance, which is something known as negritude. Negritude in general means the idea of seeking some kind of communality and empowerment of Black cultural experience. Also, sometimes it means seeking some kind of innate aesthetic that is associated with that shared experience. It is also, by the time we get to the 1960s, very closely associated with a leader of Senegal who is Leopold Sédar Senghor's his name, who was someone who promoted negritude for African cultures in order to basically fight against colonialism in Africa. So it's an idea of trying to create images that are derived from the shared experience of Black culture and also about Black empowerment, and also are connected to these movements that were taking place, such as in Senghor's Senegal, in order to fight against colonialism. So in The Conjure Woman here, what we're seeing is what Romare Bearden called a composite of kind of the old wise woman in Black culture that exists in every neighborhood culture. It also exists in Africa. This is like the old woman who's got massive amounts of knowledge, who is consulted by everyone when you need to consult someone. She's usually composite, as you see here, of African masks, of actual eyes of Black people taken from magazines. She almost always, in order to recognize her in Romare Bearden's work, she holds a cane, and you see behind her she's associated with nature as well. She is the figure, again, that is kind of an embodiment of Black cultural knowledge, is the way that he put it. This is a work that's called The Dove from 1964. It employs some things that we've already seen before in earlier African American artists' works, but now it's as a photo montage. We see the Conjure Woman again over here off to the right. She's holding her cane that is a twisted piece of wood that looks a little bit like the Surgeon General's Adusis. She is, again, a composite of images of a Black woman from a magazine, things that are taken from different sources, as if to say this is our cultural knowledge. In this scene, you see a whole host of representations of things that are part of the urban experience of Black folk. all taken from different sources and put together into one place. A very crowded urban environment, people once again sitting on their stoops and talking to one another, representing different types of people. For instance, the guy here with a cigarette in his hand and the hat, covering his eyes, and with this kind of jutting look to his legs, is kind of the cool young black man. People up here sitting in the windows looking out, represented, by the way, by the back of a Polaroid picture here, to show you something about the how crowded these scenes are. The dove, which gives the title of the work, sits above the doorway in the center. The dove is a symbol of Christianity, the Holy Spirit specifically, so very closely associated with Black culture's adoption of Christian ideas. Again, all the way through, I'm not going to bore you to death with all this, but the emphasis on the fingernails here, Black beautification of both hair and of fingernails, which is a big part of Black culture even today. He's really trying to pick up on things that are very specific to Black culture and render them in this space in order to say something about Black shared experience. And finally, the one that is represented in your textbook, this one is The Prevalence of Ritual Baptism from 1964. Same kinds of things going on. Composites of actual Black people taken from magazines mixed together with images of African masks here, all put into one space. The conjure woman is up here in the corner again with her hair covering here, and the emphasis here in the title on baptism, the idea, and you see this up in the upper corner too, of Christianity being a common thread that bonds together Black people and their shared humanity. I know this has only been a very brief kind of look at some African American arts through mid-century, and I wish it were more, but at least you have some indication of some of the major trends and some of the major artists here. And if you were to take another art history class in contemporary art, particularly from me, we'll pick this up and go into more detail. Thanks for listening.